the topic for today. You know, when I mentioned to Barb during the summer that I had done a sermon that was inspired by something her mother said to me way back in 2001 or 2012 when I was the visiting minister at the Dorothea Dix congregation, I had no idea that it would coincide with the Pope's visit. And now I think to myself, gee, aren't I smart? But really, I think, talk about synchronicity. It's a message from the universe in a way. And it's a message, too, about how we are similar in some ways to the Christian world and how we have moved beyond it. When I was in theological school, the minister who taught the history course was the most boring professor I have ever had. And I say that as a former professor myself, and I say it also because he was really, really boring. But he was good at answering questions. And one day I asked him how he would describe Unitarian Universalism to someone who was not. And he said, this is a post-Christian faith. Our roots are in Jewish teachings that became adopted by the followers of the way known as Jesus. They were refined over the years when the Nicene Council excommunicated Arius, called him a heretic, and many others who did not believe in a Trinitarian God. And we've gone through many, many stages coming back together into a kind of general theological view of the world. We've gone through humanism, transcendentalism, back to humanism, and now we're in a place where we have a wide embrace and a big tent, as it's sometimes called, for people of all different religious and philosophical positions, including those with none. This is the place where you come to be who you are, and to explore the possibilities of who you might become and who other people might be and might be becoming. It is a place where there have been ministers in different countries, and in the Unitarian churches in Romania, there are very traditional services, very Christian in their organization and in their teachings. And I've decided to do a service for you using Romanian teachings from a Sunday service from Romania so that you get a taste of what that's like. Because that's the place where Unitarianism remained frozen in time. It was frozen because of the communist takeover of Romania and the insistence that nothing be changed in any churches that already existed at the time. Now, we have gone through a lot of changes, including the fact that 50% of the ministers in this tradition are women, more than 50%, that we have been ordaining ministers of all different sexual identifications, gender identifications for several years now, that we have ordained people of color, people from many different ethnic backgrounds, and that we have tried to bring the world into this tradition, to go out into it and to bring the world into it. And with varying degrees of success, I must say. Some congregations have become very, very interesting to walk through and look at, and others, not quite so much variety yet. One of the centerpieces in this tradition is the issue of authority. Now, I have heard it said many times that being in a Unitarian Universalist congregation for the minister is like herding cats. I would say wild cats, large wild cats. Part of that is because of the different positions people have, and part of it is because people come into this tradition because here we are welcome to ask questions. We are welcome to think for ourselves. This is a very adult kind of tradition, one in which we are encouraged to encourage others to discover themselves. We are encouraged to learn and study other ways of being, other spiritual practices, other contemplative practices. And so we are not set in a fundamentalist course. We are definitely way out there in a progressive movement into the future. And this only works if you're willing to be like that. If that is your nature, if you're willing to accept it in other people. There are many people who will be terrified to come into a Unitarian Universalist church. They go, whoa, anything goes. They believe anything. One of my favorite sermons that I read several years ago online began with a sentence to the effect of, no, a German Shepherd cannot be a Unitarian. And I still laugh thinking about that because I think of all the crazy things that people have said to me. And I'll share a few of them with you because I think they're funny. When I was at Drew Theological School, which is a very liberal Methodist school, I walked into the bar, which was hilarious because the Methodists at the time were not drinking. But there's a bar there. And I overheard one student saying to another, I don't know why they have ministers. They don't believe in God. And I thought, I bet he doesn't know any Unitarians. So I tiptoed up and I said, do you know any Unitarians? No, are you one? And I said, yeah. And I said, before you make a big announcement like that, you need to explain what God means to you. You don't know what Unitarians think about God. You don't know how people decide what God is. Then I was in another place, also at Drew, where someone said, well, since they don't worship anything, why do they even have Sunday worship? And I thought, you know, I should do a service about Unitarian Universalism in this place. But instead I did one that totally astonished them all. It was all about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I will do it for you sometime in the spring when we get closer to Mother's Day. Because it caused a small revolution among a lot of the students there who had never thought about Mary as a real teenage unwed mother. And I did it in bare feet. I did it dressed with prayer shawls from the 1st century. And I did it from the perspective of Mary recovering from the death of Jesus, which we don't talk about. And even as Unitarians, we don't tend to talk about. Today, I want to talk with you about what makes Unitarian ministers, and what the differences and similarities are between the ordained ministry and the lay ministry. I think it's important to talk about these things because so many of us come into this tradition with no background in Unitarian Universalist history, and we know very little about what goes on within the institution itself. We know how the Pope becomes the Pope, but you don't know how I became a minister. Do you? You might know a little more, but most people do not. And it's important to understand because when I was working at Somerset Hills, the religious education director and I were doing a service together, and he called all the kids up to the front of the room. It was a huge congregation with lots of kids, and they're all sitting at his feet, and he said, so, Julie's our minister. Who knows what a minister is? I don't know if I told you this. And one little boy's hand goes up and he says, is she the prime minister? And I thought, I found my calling. I'm the prime minister. This, of course, is not true. Ordained ministers begin life just like everyone else as lay people. They have the same human frailties and foibles that everyone else has. Unlike most lay leaders, however, they feel called to commit themselves to the profession of ministry, be it parish, community, consulting, developmental, visiting, and so on, often in the face of significant personal hardship, financial, marital, parental, spiritual, academic, etc. Many of them, but not all, can describe their experience of feeling or hearing the call. The details may vary, but the sense is often the same of realizing something deep inside leading one irresistibly into service for a faith tradition and a community, no matter the cost. Because not to do so would be ruinous to one's sense of being, to one's core identity. Now that doesn't mean it's easy. I had to take 3 months off from theological school. I had a complete breakdown in the middle of school because of the stress of the studies, because of my own crisis about what I was feeling and thinking about my ministerial identity. And mind you, I had already been ordained once as an interfaith minister several years before that happened. This is not unusual. It's like doctors. Lots of doctors go through a big crisis in medical school about whether to continue with their studies or not, about whether to change the path they're on. I'm glad I had that breakdown, because when I went back, I had a completely different focus. The same thing happened to Pope Francis. He had a breakdown. He was sent away to Cordoba, out in the sticks in Argentina. And as many people said, he went through a long, dark night of the soul trying to understand what his new identity was going to be as a priest. He had not been so popular before he went away and went through that change. If you stay the path to ordination, it's because you feel that that is what you are all about, that that's where your greatest gift is in being and giving to other people. There are many lay people who consider going into professional ministry, but they never start. Or they do, and then they leave. Some realize this isn't the passion they thought it might be. Some decide they would rather not deal with all the conflict in congregational life. And there is conflict in congregational life. Some decide they can't manage the financial sacrifices. Well, as the district executive of Metro New York said, do not go into ministry unless you're married to a wealthy partner or have inherited a lot of money. And I thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble. Some can't manage the stress of balancing family and ministerial life. I was a single mother of a very small person who's probably over at Walmart right now roaming around. She's coming to pick me up later. She had to sit through 3 years of my working, essentially 24 hours a day, studying, working, and I went to school full-time for 3 years, including summers. So when I graduated, I made her a diploma. The day that I was getting in line in my vestments, I said, this is for you. And she opened it up. It was a priceless moment. I had made a document that said Life Learning Achievement Award. And I wrote her name in script. Mother. And I told the dean of students, this school should provide these to the children of all the older students in this school. At least half of us have kids, and we're leaving our kids to do this work. You need to recognize them, not just us, you do. But of course, they've never done it. Those who continue down the path toward ministerial fellowship and ordination go through a long process in which they are shaped by years of academic study, pastoral counseling training, rigorous scrutiny by those more experienced than they, and it can be very tough. Vast amounts of reading and writing, ongoing education with other ministers, psychological assessment, and that was a real treat, and often debt. I'm still paying student loans, 15 years later, still paying student loans. This is an arduous journey. People do not enter ministry lightly, ever. While it can feel like an endurance test, it's really intended to help prospective clergy mature and grow. That is its true purpose, to grow hearts, minds, and souls as preachers, teachers, healers, speakers, friends, and leaders. In the best of all possible worlds, ordained ministers are driven by a desire to serve and care for others. As a bishop in South India said to me, Jesus didn't ask for a commitment to him. He asked for a commitment to the people who are here on earth now. Isn't this what we as Unitarian Universalists are about? We are committed to the present time, the time we know we have. We are also here to think about the people who are going to follow us here, now, then, in the future. In the best of all possible worlds, everyone in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, including the clergy, has a desire to minister according to his or her gifts to the community of which he or she is a part. Hopefully to the greater faith community beyond and to the world community at large. Within our congregations, that may mean making the coffee, tending to the building, leading worship, sitting on committees, holding someone's hands, and simply listening very, very closely. Putting it another way, here you will be cared for, and here you will be asked to care for others. If you are not caring for anyone else in the congregation when you are in it, you're not really in it. You're visiting. In the 1500s, and I can't believe I'm going to quote him, Martin Luther, spoke of the priesthood of all believers. UU congregations went way beyond Luther. I once said something in the presence of my boyfriend, and he said, "Julie, that doesn't sound like a very priest-like comment." I said, "You're confusing me with someone else. I'm not a priest. I'm not even a priestess." We have never had those, and our gatherings are home to all sorts of skeptics and seekers as well as believers. Our gatherings are created to be democratic communities in which we covenant to make room for one another and in which we recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every person. At our best, we are, and this is my own term, communities of ministers. Each of you has the power to be a minister in this room. You just have to choose what your ministry will be as part of this congregation. Love reveals itself in a sincere interest in the well-being of others. And in the best of all possible worlds, each of us is driven by caring behavior rather than by fear. Fear can reveal itself as insecurity, manipulation, power, and ego-tripping. Love and fear in various forms and sizes are equal opportunity drives that can be found in both ordained and lay ministers. What to do about that? First, we have to remember that each of us is human, including the minister. I've been mistaken for a lot of things I didn't know I was being mistaken for. And later it's like, what? You thought that? How did you jump to that conclusion? Second, each of us has his or her unique gifts. Neither ordained clergy nor lay leaders are saints. Do you remember when I talked about St. Patrick? On St. Patrick's Day, and I said he wasn't born a saint. He was born into poverty, he was kidnapped, he was a slave. And only many, many, many years later was he named a saint. We are not really about sainthood after all, but about reality and transforming our lives and living conditions for the better. Second, each of us in this room and every other Unitarian Universalist room brings emotional baggage with us. Together we arrive at the baggage claim, the community baggage, where all our baggage is sitting together. I bring baggage, each of you brings baggage, and together the congregation develops its own psychological and emotional baggage. It's important to remember that. We don't know everything about each other. We don't know about all the individual pain we have suffered, or the individual joys we have suffered. We're always looking further into getting to know one another. There's a variety and a range of talents among us, and as time goes on, some abilities may wax and others may wane. There's always the possibility of surprise, growth, and change. Some ministers choose to move on. Some congregants do the same. Sometimes congregations move on. Number 4, the road divides when it comes to responsibilities and what these are going to be in any particular congregation. And those really have to be determined and clearly understood by all parties concerned. In hiring negotiations with potential ordained clergy, both sides need to know what they're hoping for and what they're getting. I will tell you right now, I am not the person to put in charge of the budget. Don't go there with me. We have to ask ourselves, who is going to do what? And what happens if a complication arises? How do we address and resolve conflict? How do we keep refreshing ourselves, transforming ourselves as our numbers shrink and as they grow? Of course, the beginning is just the beginning, and things can and do shift over time. Accepting change is critical to both personal and congregational growth, and it's very hard for some people to deal with. Easier for others. Concerns from either side need to be reviewed in the beginning and all along the way, preferably as soon as they arise, not months later after a lot of A recurring theme in congregational life is the interplay of authority, responsibility, and accountability. This includes understandings about congregational autonomy and the matter of who is in charge of what. How do we fit everyone together to contain and honor everyone? Developing a covenantal agreement of right relations, in addition to a contract between the congregation and clergy, helps to clarify the nature of the mutual regard for and responsibilities to be assumed on both sides. A job description, after all, is not identical with people's expectations about the roles of those who work with them. We need to get as much out in the open as possible. Transparency lies at the core of healthy congregational life, and it requires us to be thoughtful, kind in our expressions, and honest with ourselves and each other. A covenant helps us to live in a spirit of walking together, for we are in this together. We need to avoid hiding our concerns and to avoid whispering about them to everyone but the person concerned. Whispering leads to bad feelings. I cannot tell you how many Unitarian Universalist ministers I know who have found themselves surrounded by whispering. Whispering that then led to a congregational survey that was really just a tool to go after the minister. Now, there is an important distinction between lay and ordained leaders when it comes to accountability. Clergy are accountable to lay people inside the congregation and outside it, to the Unitarian Universalist Association and the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association. Ordained ministry is both career and calling, and clergy may and do face the possibility of official investigations, sanctions, and so on, including being stripped of their credentials, banned from all pulpits. And these are things which lay people and congregations as unique entities are never subjected to. They are not punished, even if people in a congregation are behaving badly. There is no outside mechanism that calls a congregation to, onto the carpet, that can scold it or help it or encourage it or re-educate it to do things better. No one has power over any individual congregation. This imbalance means that the playing field is not level, it's tilted. It is tilted, which is why it is so important to be careful when tilting starts, being felt. When you think that something is out of balance, you need to work really hard to get things back to an even place. Asking anyone, a staff member or a member of the congregation, to leave ought to be the decision of last resort. After all, to whom is the congregation accountable when things aren't working well? Although we talk about congregational polity and like to think that we're standing on that level playing field, it's not entirely true, which means that the congregation needs to set boundaries for disruptive or inappropriate behavior that apply to everyone in it, including the clergy, the music director, the religious education director, everyone. We are progressive, but we cannot be entirely permissive people and expect everyone to experience healthy congregational life. Healthy congregations are the ones that grow and attract new life and have a clear sense of purpose and vitality. They understand that just because we are religiously liberal, we are not perfect people. We make mistakes. Just because many of us are self-professed liberals, and certainly not all Unitarian Universalists are, does not mean that we are not capable of that old-time word, sin. Pope Francis would probably say, yes, this is true. Yes, sin, just a theological word for mistake. So let's remember that as with other things in life, no minister or lay leader can please all the people all the time. Ministerial candidates are ordained into service, not sainthood. And as I've often said, even though I've been ordained twice, I have definitely not become more saintly. I am still just as wild and crazy in my private life as I was before I was ordained. I try to be on my best behavior with you, because I'm here to serve you. But it's important to remember, that ministers are not perfect people. Not one of you is perfect either. I know I am not perfect. It is well known, that people project their issues onto clergy, transferring to them, conflating with them, identities that start with earlier relationships, particularly family of origin issues. I'm going to tell you about an experience I had with that. One of my theological school professors, who is a Unitarian, as it turns out, and a member of the Summit congregation, said, "The biggest burden the clergy bear is the projections of the congregation." How often does anyone out there in the pews or chairs think about that? Is anyone out there aware of this tendency? I don't think so, unless it's pointed out. Does any of this sound familiar? I once had a congregant who insisted on treating me as if I were her mother. I heard from the president of the congregation that this particular woman was upset with me. And so I called her up because she hadn't come to a class the night before on building your own theology, and I was concerned about that. But when I got the call from the president, I thought, I need to call her about this. So I called up and I said, "Hi, this is Julie." And she said, "Oh, did Jim talk to you?" And I thought, I said, "Well, actually, I'm calling because you weren't in class." She had some sort of neurological illness, like lupus, something like that, which is probably a different kind of illness, but okay. I said, "As it happens, he did speak to me. He told me you were very angry with me." I said, "Why are you angry with me?" And she said, "Well, you didn't answer my email." And I thought, does she have any idea how much email I get every day? I said, "You sent me an email?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "What was it about?" And she said, "It was about a fight I was having with someone else in the congregation." And I said, Oh. And I said, and that woman, she's had fights with a number of other people, hasn't she? She said, "Yes." And then she just threw me a bone. She said, "Julie, I have issues with women in authority." But here we go. And I said, "Women in authority?" She said, "Yes, really it's my mother." And I started laughing, and I said, "I had issues with my mother." And then we just started laughing. And we laughed, and I said, "Would you like to have coffee with me so we can talk about our mothers?" And she said, "That would be great." Now, it turned out we didn't have to talk about our mothers, because we both acknowledged our mothers were the problem in our seeing each other. I didn't have that problem seeing her. She had it seeing me. On some level, she thought I had power. And it's true that a lot of congregants see the ministers as very powerful people. I've never thought of myself as a powerful person, and this was a big mistake I made among congregation. I didn't understand that people saw me very differently from the way I understood myself. I didn't understand that there was some fear around talking to me openly about things because they thought I could do something to them. In fact, in the Unitarian Universalist congregation, I can't do anything to anybody. You're not going to be excommunicated if you're here. I'm not going to make you say 5, Hail Marys and the Lord's Prayer or count rosary beads. I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm just going to listen and ask you to tell me what is happening with you. How can I be of any assistance to you? But it takes a while in ministry to realize that other people are covering you with all these other assignments and other positions. Ironically, members are sometimes aware of the fact that some clergy do have their issues and agendas, and that a minister's projections can also move out into the congregation. Perhaps the issue of projection needs to be reviewed from time to time, so that instead of everybody assuming they know what the minister thinks or feels, they can find out by taking the time to talk to the minister, usually privately, or over a cup of coffee, or taking a walk, or something. No one wants to be the target of the minister, and the minister certainly doesn't want to be the target of the congregation. It contradicts the observance of our own first principle to respect the inherent worth and dignity of one another. It is only too easy for some people in a congregation, and it only takes 5 to 10 people, depending on the size of the congregation, to destroy the spirit in the congregation, to force a minister to leave, to cause all kinds of disruption. It's very disruptive. It leads to heartbreak and often to unfairly tarnished reputations for the targets and a bad reputation for the congregation, which then becomes known, and some of you have maybe heard me say this, as a congregation that eats ministers. When ministers go into search looking for new places to serve, they read through the history of the congregation, and they can tell just looking at the number of ministers who've been there and the number of years they've served that there's a big problem in the congregation. So, coming to the end, we are joined in the unique task of building a beloved community. Instead of assuming that we know what we are thinking, we need to take the time to get to know what we're thinking. It takes time, commitment, and interest. We need to remember the principle of acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. We need to set and maintain appropriate boundaries and accountability zones. We need to consider creating committees on ministry that nurture all sides and examine the ministry of the entire congregation. These are not committees that are only about the minister. So let us determine to speak the truth with love, to advance in our emotional and spiritual growth by owning both our joys and concerns in our relationships. Let us move toward pledging ourselves to greater service and to the creation of agreements that awaken us to our intentions as giving, sharing people. We have to work to stay at the table. We have to remember to use the practice of appreciative inquiry, asking what we want more of rather than what we want less of. If we hold to this course, we have a better chance of making our dreams come true. Ministry is partnership in work and spirit, and it is up to us, all of us, lay and ordained, to help our congregations succeed. So what makes a minister a minister? The conscious decision to serve others as we, lay and ordained, go about the business of changing and healing the world both within and outside our congregational gatherings. If by asking who's in charge we mean who is responsible, then I believe the answer would be each one of us is responsible according to our particular gifts, each of us who participates in and commits to congregational life.